This is weird.
We came in peace for all your cash.
Hey guys, Pete here. The thing that pulled me into For All Mankind's orbit is this idea that history could be drastically different if just a few key events happened differently. The main event here is that the space race never ended, and that led to a series of changes that managed to produce a reality that's more hopeful than the one we're currently living in. I thought the closing shot of this episode really encapsulated that perfectly. You have the wonders of space and watching the sunrise as it comes out from behind Earth. You have the heroism from Danny's actions that's necessary in so many of these high-stress situations. And you have the fragility of it all as he's suspended at the end of that tether. It's the fragility of the positive changes in this timeline, the fragility of the characters who are getting older, and the fragility of keeping things together in a show that skips a decade in between seasons. Episode 1 opens with a montage catching us up on all that's happened in between, just like Season 2 did. Because this is all so crucial to how the story is constructed, I'll be doing a full breakdown of the changes from our timeline later this week. That'll give me a little time to watch all the minisodes they added on Apple TV that fill in the gaps and read up some on the real events that happened in our timeline. The big points that affect our understanding of this episode are that Gary Hart avoided his sex scandal and became the president in 1984 after Reagan completed his second term in this timeline. He's reelected in 1988, while Ellen Wilson is elected as a Republican senator in Texas in 1986. This sets up a race between her and Bill Clinton in the opening year of Season 3, 1992. This is when Clinton became president in our timeline. But Ellen is the girl who caught the tank, so it'll be interesting to see just how much people love astronauts in the show's timeline. Things continue to develop at an accelerated pace, and there are mentions of the new character Deb Ayesa and his partner Richard Hilliard making a game-changing discovery related to clean nuclear energy. They've mastered nuclear fusion, which is a lot cleaner than the fission technology we use in our timeline, but impractical due to helium-3's rarity. But then we also learn that they discovered that to be in abundance on the moon. Their company will partner with NASA to mine it, and we see that this shift has drastically reduced global warming. Karen partnered with Sam to start a space tourism industry, and Danny Stevens has followed in his parents' footsteps to become an astronaut. The focus on the continued space race has been good for the Soviet Union. Instead of collapsing, they're thriving under Gorbachev, who implemented a hybrid socialist market economy. Their influence is spreading throughout the Western Hemisphere and now includes Mexico right on the US border. Space travel is expanding to more countries, including India and China, who have aspirations for their own moon base, and North Korea, who scrapped a ballistic missile program to focus on space. In the show's present, we find Karen Baldwin on the space hotel/ship in orbit that her company Polaris built, which is where episode 1 gets its name. She gets a call from her business partner, Sam, who was Tracy's second husband after Gordo, who we saw Karen sell the outpost to at the end of last season. They're there getting ready for the first group of guests to arrive, and the commercial space tourism industry is prepared to take its next leap forward. After the credits, there's another installment in the Margo waking up and getting ready for work in her office series. This is how we met Margo back in 1969, and in each new season, we see that her hard work is at least getting her a more comfortable place to crash. Here in 1992, it becomes apparent that because the show skips through time, it has to front load a lot of details into this sequence to try to bring us up to speed. Also, Margo has been working for NASA for 30 years, and she'll have been at JSC for more or less that long before the season ends. So they have to introduce new characters like the assistant who Emma is training. Margo is now the director of NASA, and it feels like this will be the last season for her generation of characters to be the center of attention. We get a quick look at updated tech here as well. She has a flat panel display showing the mission status board, and Nori has an Apple PDA that looks much more advanced than the Newton message pad that existed at that time but never really caught on. In her briefing, we learn that Debayesa is trying to curry favor with her and that a North Korean rocket has exploded in orbit. Inside Mars Mission Control, we learn that Bill has become a flight director and that they're testing a new nuclear rocket engine on the moon. It's not working, and if they can't fix it, they'll miss the 96 Mars launch window. Aleda's on the project and she's going to have to figure this out. And we learn later that she'll have to go to the moon to try to apply her fix in person. We also learn that her father is now back in the US, living with her and her husband and their son. Margo and her staff also learn that Russia has announced that they're going to Mars in 96. And her pal Sergei delivers the party line on TV saying that they'll be the first to get there. From that announcement, we learn that there's pressure on Margo to name their commander, which has come down to a choice between Danielle and Ed Baldwin. Molly Cobb is still the head of the astronaut office, and she appears to have adjusted to losing her eyesight. Margo tries to press her to announce Danielle as the Mars commander, but she's leaning towards Ed. This disagreement highlights the ways NASA is changing, and Molly still thinks that someone with a test pilot background like Ed is the better choice. A little bit later, Margo goes to pick up a record that her assistant gave her a message about, and we learn that this is a code for her to contact Sergei. He asks her for some help, and we learn that they've been secretly helping each other over the years. He brings up this year's IAC conference, which gives them a chance to show that they have this affection for each other, and reminds us of the closing moments of season 2 when the KGB was watching his call to her. She walks away from the phone smiling, thinking about this conference, and he gets a follow-up call from his handlers, telling him to put more pressure on her to help them with their nuclear engine, which makes it sound like they've announced this trip to Mars, but they're not quite ready. Ed and Danny are both visiting the Polaris Hotel for Danny Stevens' wedding. Their competition for the Mars commander job is lively, and we see that they've both been remarried and are traveling with their significant others. Danny Stevens does marry his girlfriend Amber in the first ever wedding in space, which turns out to be pretty uncomfortable. We learn a lot of little details here, like he's gotten sober after his parents' death. Jimmy Stevens makes things pretty awkward with his best man speech, where he makes some accusations against NASA. We find out that Kelly is a research scientist in Antarctica rather than a pilot, but we don't really get many more details there. And then things get really uncomfortable when in the first dance with his wife, Danny plays the version of Don't Be Cruel that he danced to with Karen when they were first starting their affair. This understandably freaks Karen out, and I'm not sure what he was going for here, because everything had been pointing to the fact that he'd moved on and was pretty happy in this new relationship. We don't get to learn anything more about it, though, because a piece of debris from the North Korean rocket explosion hits one of the Polaris's thrusters, and that causes it to do an uncommanded burn. This sets up an intense situation where the gravity continues to increase, and things get worse when they send 2 people out to do a repair, and they get killed after a cable breaks loose. That wreaks havoc on the ship as it thrashes around, and when they try to evacuate everyone through the elevators, Sam is killed. Ed injures his leg, and things are looking dire for anyone to be able to get from the ring to the shuttles under this amount of gravity. The only path out is to use an emergency access shaft, which is essentially a ladder, and thinking about trying to climb up that, at 2 Gs your body feels like it weighs twice as much, and that just keeps going up. Because Ed is injured, Danny gets his chance to be the hero, and in a thrilling sequence he goes out and is able to shut the thruster down. I thought this looked fantastic, and I mean, I didn't really think everyone was going to die here, but it felt a little strange, like it didn't feel like Danny had been developed as this super astronaut or whatever we're supposed to accept that he is here. And I suppose that's just part of what happens when we have to jump over this large period of time. Like if I compare this to the season 2 premiere, I really felt something when Molly left that lava tube and went into the radiation to try to save Wubbo. But as I mentioned, I really like that closing scene, and it gets you excited for all of the space stuff you know is sure to come throughout the rest of the season.
I can still remember him sitting in that living room that night in '69, glued to the TV, watching the Soviets plant their red flag on the moon. The tears were rolling down his cheeks.
The race for Mars is on. All the potential factions trying to get there first have been established, and we get a glimpse of the changing of the guard at NASA. Kind of, because, well, Margo's still in charge. But it's out with the old and in with the new, and it turns out that at least one member of the new generation is a sort of psycho stalker type. There are tensions inside the Geezer network, and that has some of our heroes feeling sorry for themselves. It's just a temporary thing, though, because there's a new player in the game to shake things up, and they're handing out second chances. Game Changer is the title of this week's episode, and that refers to Dev Ayesa and his aerospace company Helios. We learned in the opening sequence of the first episode that he is filthy rich, and he got that way when he made breakthroughs in clean nuclear fusion energy with his partner. This was no small achievement, and it even helped to roll back the effects of global warming. In order for it to be a viable source of energy, they have to mine helium-3 on the moon, and that put him in the business of going to space. The episode opens with Karen being taken out to a meeting with him in the desert. Polaris's disaster happened to be at the perfect time for him, and he makes her an opening offer on her business that's so generous it makes her suspicious. As they're talking, she realizes his company is developing a methane engine, and that means that they're trying to get to Mars, but they don't have time to make a ship of their own and still be competitive with NASA and the Soviets, who are both planning on launching their mission in 4 years. He wants to buy the hotel and put these new engines on it so that he can get into the race. In the process of trying to make the deal, he tells Karen an inspiring speech about his father that explains why he's interested in the first place. And it seems like we can probably take him at his word at this point in the story. And when all is said and done, she gets a great deal and he gets a spaceship. At JSC, Molly learns through a memo that the higher-ups are trying to gain more influence over her office. She goes looking for Margo, who still isn't back from her trip, and we watch her complain to Emma. Then she decides to make a move. She goes back to her office, calls in Danielle, tells her she won't be the commander of Mars 96, and it's clear that she's doing this to strike back against Margo. She's doing it when she's not there. She's doing it even though she told her that they would talk whenever she got back, and she knows this will cause problems. But the way things are currently set up, she still has the ultimate authority and decides to use it. She laid out her reasons in the premiere of why she thought that Ed was the better choice, and she tells Danny the same thing. She obviously doesn't agree, but doesn't have a problem with running Ed's backup crew. Molly goes to tell him the good news, and he's beside himself. He can't believe it, and he is really pumped up. We catch up with Karen, who's clearing out her office at Polaris, and Danny stops by while he's there to pick up Tracy's astronaut pin from Sam's office. She has to ask him why he played the song at the reception, and he lies at first saying it was his wife's idea and then leaves, but turns right back around and comes back in to tell her that he lied. He makes a play telling her that he can't put it behind him, even after all these years, and she shuts it down in a way that doesn't leave any room for misinterpretation. She even adds a little slap in there, which is a nice touch. We get the idea that there's a long history of this sort of thing, that when he was drinking, he was showing up to her house drunk, and that she thought that he had gotten over it, that he moved past it when he got sober. One thing that I thought was interesting is that he brings up Ed, and it's clear that he really doesn't like them together. It seems like him being worried that they might get back together is a part of what's happening right now. She doesn't want to have anything to do with it, and she tells him that he needs to go home to his wife, and he does eventually leave. At their home, Ellen and Larry are discussing her idea of having John McCain as her running mate, and he's against it. He stresses that she needs to get someone that's different, that will appeal to the base, especially someone who will bring in the evangelicals. And he does mention that at this point, she's behind Bill Clinton in the polls. Later, she'll have a meeting with this new character, Governor Bragg, where she does bring him on board. But the real twist in this scene is that Ellen and Larry have a child. It's a big surprise, and they have this nice interaction where they seem like one big happy family. At the office, Danny and Ed continue their friendly rivalry. You can tell that she's devastated not to get the command, but she does back her friend up and congratulate him for getting the mission, and we see them share a moment. He goes to call Kelly and offers her a spot on his crew. We learn that he's ending his marriage with Yvonne, and that this isn't the first divorce that he's had after Karen. I'm guessing it's the second, but the way she says it, there could be more, I guess. I thought it stood out that one of the reasons that Margo favored Danny was her interest and knowledge of science. And here we see Kelly trying to tell her father what she's doing in her research, and he really isn't even paying attention. Danny comes home to tell her husband that she didn't get the command spot, and after what happened on Polaris, he's actually relieved. We get to see her at home with her family, and things look pretty good there, but this all turns out to be set up because when Margo gets back, she learns from Bill that Molly made her decision to name Ed while she was gone. This leads to an interesting confrontation. Margo is in charge of the agency, but knows that she can't force Molly to do what she wants. Molly is throwing that in her face, so she decides that her only choice is to fire her. And it's the type of situation where you don't like the choice, but can absolutely understand why she made it. Plus, neither one of them are exactly right. For these being two characters we like, it's pretty hard to get behind either one of them in the way that they handled this. Margo follows up by having the conversation with Ed to tell him that he won't be going to Mars. He's understandably devastated and angry, and essentially says that the pencil pushers in the lab coats have finally taken over. Again, we can understand his perspective here, but Molly's decision is the one that created this situation, and they're gonna always side with each other. The two of them have a drink in her office and discuss how their time has passed. And this reminded me of their conversation when they were on the moon searching for the ice, about how they were selfish and they were narcissistic, and you know what? Now they're getting pretty old. Speaking of the moon, we get a quick look at Aleida arriving there, and it's a lot of fun to see her face. But also, we get to see how Jamestown base has expanded over the last 9 years, and it's pretty impressive. Overall, it's a pretty short visit, but we do see her call her father, and it looks like he might be starting to experience early signs of dementia or something like that. This makes me think about how involved her job is. We've seen that Margo, who is essentially her mentor, doesn't have room for the family life at all. And now we're getting hints that Aleida's might be more complicated than it appeared in the first episode. Ed and Danny meet up at the now corporate outpost, which I don't think anyone's happy about the changes they've made to this place. It seems like a Disneyfication kind of situation that goes way beyond the ferns that Karen introduced in season 2. He's upset, he's drunk, and insinuates that if it were a level playing field, that is, if politics and optics weren't involved, he would be the obvious choice. Which is a pretty on-brand way to look at it by a guy like him in that situation. When you're always used to being on top, there has to be an explanation when things go wrong. Some external force working against you. But it goes beyond him just being a bad friend. Because as viewers, we know that he's just wrong here. None of what he's talking about is responsible for why they made this decision. Plus, when the shoe was on the other foot, Danielle got behind him. And we saw the bond they had. And it's that connection that she loses as a result of him not getting his way. He drives over to Karen's house drunk and crashes into her gate. And we see that Danny was outside in his car watching her place, which I don't even know what to say about that. She brings him inside and cleans him up, and they talk about how they're getting older and nothing is turning out the way they thought it would. I guess the most important thing here is that it gives her an idea. And we see her go to Helios to talk to Dev to try to convince him they need someone like Ed to command their mission. She finds out she doesn't just need to convince him because they run the business as a collective. He brings it up to everyone, and after a vote, they decide to hire him. On her way out, Dev stops her to offer her a job doing whatever she wants. Basically, she'd be recruiting people, and at first she isn't interested. He picks up on the fact that it's because of what happened with the hotel, and he gives her an inspiring pep talk that brings her around and she agrees to come on board. Back at NASA, Margo tells Danny that Aleida worked out the glitch in the Nerva engine. They talk crew wish lists, and the idea that Ed was going to bring Kelly comes up before she tells Margo she wants Danny Stevens as her right seat. And this makes me really question the writer's decision to name both of these characters Danny. Before they can discuss that, Nori comes in and tells them to turn on the TV. Deb is holding a press conference where he announces that Karen's now working for Helios. Then he explains their plan to repurpose Polaris by adding their methane engines to take it to Mars. They renamed it Phoenix, and they announced that Ed will be the commander of their mission, which will be launching in the next window, a full 2 years before NASA and the Soviets plan to launch their missions. In the end, Ed got what he wanted, and when you see him on that stage, you have to wonder if that might not go to his head. There's going to be a giant competition here. He wants to get there first because he's been living with this regret that he had a chance to be the first person on the moon, but he decided to follow his mission instead. He was just awful to a longtime friend with a totally incorrect and out of line statement, and Danny is playing for the home team, so you can bet that NASA is going to do everything in their power to try to get her there first. The Soviets might have real problems getting their engine together 2 years sooner. Everything we've seen so far seems to indicate that they were going to have trouble getting it together for 96. And that means that Margo might end up in a bad situation because of her covert working relationship with Sergei. And after seeing Karen and Ed up on that stage together, it's at least possible that Danny Stevens might mutiny and crash the Sojourner 1 into the Phoenix just to take him out. We kind of go around and see everyone's reaction to this as it's airing on TV, and no one seems all that hyped up except for Molly, who we find smoking a joint in her bathtub, and the episode ends there. At the end of the last episode, everything got turned on its head as Ed defected to Helios, and they announced that they're planning to leave for Mars in 1994. Margo has to call a meeting and tells everyone that President Hart wants them to keep up the pace, which presents a lot of problems considering they were barely going to be ready for the 96 launch window. Because of the planet's respective orbits, ideal conditions for launching a trip come around every 26 months. The problem with moving things up is that their trip is dependent on launching all the supplies ahead of time so that they're already there waiting when Sojourner 1 arrives. This is all the necessary stuff like the habitation modules they'll live in, the life support systems, and fuel generators so they can run things while they're there and return back to Earth. They do find solutions for how they can move things around and how they can get everything ready. And then Aleda comes up with the idea of launching the supplies towards Venus, to use that to slingshot it back towards Mars. It will take longer than doing it in the window, but it'll still beat Danielle and her crew there by a few months. Unsurprisingly, the Soviets announced that they'll follow suit. And now we know why we saw at the end of season 2 that there were people on Mars in 1995. In her debate with Bill Clinton on the campaign trail, you see Ellen score some points by being for the accelerated timeline. This is something Americans can get behind. Seeing her in this different arena, away from her astronaut life, underlines how much everything is going to change in the future of this series. It was great to see that NASA ingenuity, and everyone working together to solve these problems one more time. But by the end of this episode, you have to wonder who will even be there after the dust settles. Aleda is poised to take over if Margo goes down, but who is left to take over for Danny as she ages out? In orbit, you see that the Polaris Hotel looks a lot different now. Those methane engines have been added and it's becoming the Phoenix. Deb is taking Ed and Karen on a tour. He mentions some of the upgrades and some mobile hab modules and that they have added triple redundancies to make sure the thrusters don't malfunction again. There's a moment where Karen stops as she walks past the elevator where Sam died that reminds us of what happened the last time they used this ship. And when they get to the flight deck, the inevitable happens. Dev starts laying out his vision for things. He wants to automate most of the flight controls and load up the crew with scientists and even a poet. And it almost feels like a setup because obviously if you're bringing on this dinosaur test pilot, He's never going to go for any of that, and of course Ed objects. Dev then makes a big scene of stopping the work and apologizing for making this huge mistake, telling the crew that they need to rework the flight control systems per the commander of the ship immediately. And I don't know, it works. It makes Ed feel like he's got control, but the way it played out and the spectacle of it feels a little fishy to me. Kelly comes in to ask Danielle if she'll keep her on NASA's mission. She makes her case, it's more science focused as she is, and even though she's been offered a slot on Helios's trip, she wants to go on the mission where she's not just there because her dad is the commander. She's been searching for life in the most inhospitable place on Earth, and they'll need her expertise when they get to Mars. Danny seems impressed and ultimately agrees to put her on the mission. So I guess that's at least part of the answer about who might be at NASA in the future. Later in a training sim, the other Danny seems distracted and crashes, which Danny finds a lot less impressive. He tells her he's got a lot going on, that he just closed on a house, and so she lets him go home and basically tells him to go romance his wife. As he leaves the building, he sees the statue of his parents outside, which is a nice touch, and then later he goes to the bar to get drunk. There's a woman there who's flirting with him pretty heavily, and he sees Karen come in, so he asks her if she wants to leave. They go to the swimming pool at his old house, and the new owners call the cops. They do let him go because he's an astronaut and they know his famous father, but they call JSC and Danny has to come to pick him up. In their conversation, there's a mention of a car crash that happened 8 years ago, and he tries to play off the fact that he's drinking again. She wants him to revoke his flight status and go get help, and tells him he needs to get himself straight and that he should go to his wife for help. Karen had come into the outpost to try to poach Aleda away from NASA. She makes her a generous offer and goes the route of saying that if she stays there, she'll always be in Margo's shadow. Aleda decides to stay loyal, and to make her point, she shows her the moon rock she brought back and tells her that Margo made that possible. She tells her if she has to be called Margo's girl, that's a small price to pay. The next morning, we catch up with her at home with her husband, who isn't thrilled she turned down the offer. It is a lot more money. They argue and she makes the case that they're doing fine compared to where she came from, and we do hear more that indicates that her father is starting to show signs of dementia. She says that she hasn't seen any of that, and it's really that she's not trying to see it, and her husband points out, yeah, maybe that's because she's never there. We see Amber Stevens at home, and Danny comes in planning to tell her something, probably about his relapse and not going to Mars. But before he can get into any of it, Ed gives him a call and offers him a spot on Helios's mission. His ass is saved, and I'm not sure if Ed knows what he's getting himself into by bringing on someone who's obsessed with his ex-wife as his wingman. Danny does come into Helios to try to change his mind, but he thinks this is all just because Danny needs a purpose. The same way that Gordo needed a purpose when he sent him back to the moon. And with a guy like Ed, that's just that. No one's really going to change his mind. He comes in to tell his team and make the announcement, and that's when we see Karen get shaken up. Later at the outpost, Kelly breaks the news that she'll be going with NASA and that she was the one who asked Danielle to put her on that mission. At first, Ed looks hurt, but he ends up being supportive. So I skipped over the cold open because it all sets up what happens next. In that, we have flashbacks to IAC conferences in London over the years. This is where Margo and Sergei see each other, and in the first one, we see them enter an elevator together after finally having that drink that they talked about at the end of season 2. There's clear romantic tension that's left over from his trip to the States, but she rushes out the door as soon as it arrives on her floor as he stands there staring at her longingly. And I do think it's worth mentioning that there's a very deliberate shot to get you to notice that he's wearing a wedding ring in this first sequence. Over the years, we see that they continue to see each other here, and basically the same things happen. And it's all to play up this idea of will they or won't they. At different points, we see one or the other stop when they get out of the elevator or hold the door. And in 1991, he finally makes his move and touches her hand. And in this shot, you can see that he's no longer wearing that wedding ring. The setup here was great because she puts her hand in a place where it looks like she's inviting him to hold it, but it's all very subtle. It fits with her character. There's the relief that it finally happens, and then disappointment when the elevator stops and this other guy gets in and they have to pretend like nothing's going on. Sergei pauses when it's time to leave, hoping that she'll follow him, but because this guy knows who they are, she just says goodnight and sends him away. Fast forward to the present day, they're back in London, and this time Dev is there laying on the charm. Margo and Sergei meet up again, and they watch him and discuss how his entering the space race is changing things. They have drinks, and then later, while they're standing at the bar, the bartender tells them that it's last call. Margo says she can use another drink and tells Sergei to grab the bottle, and it's on. They don't say anything in the elevator. He uses the bathroom, and while he's in there, she looks in the mirror, and it reminds you that this moment was 10 years in the making. And we see him do the same thing, and it appears that there's this shared reservation. But we know there's more going on with what he's thinking about. He comes out, and when he starts to make small talk and pour the drink, she interrupts saying, "I would like you to kiss me." It all starts out pretty awkward. It's pretty obvious that this is not Margo's comfort zone, but it does start to get hot, and then Sergei stops. In a monumentally unromantic move, he starts talking about work. He explains that they can't get their nuclear engine cooling system to work and begs her, and I mean begs her to help because if he fails, there will be serious consequences. She points out that they have this agreement. They trade secrets to help each other out as far as space is concerned, but anything that could be used for military use is off the table. He tries to bring her around, but eventually he gives up, saying he understands and that he apologizes for everything, which seems a little out of place. As soon as he says that, there's a knock at the door, and then you understand what he was saying. And before they open it, there's a great shot of her where you see that she starts to realize what she's gotten herself into. Intelligence agents come in. They show her compromising photos they've collected, showing her talking with Sergei. She's still adamant about not sharing the engine design, but the agents point out that she's been sharing classified information with them for 9 years. Her comeback is that anything she shared was for the furtherance of space travel and in the interest of international peace, which of course is naive, and the agent points out that the FBI would consider her a spy and a traitor. Still, she's willing to take that chance. And when they see that she's serious, they start strangling Sergei right in front of her. The threat is explicit. If she doesn't help, they'll kill him, and they give her a day to think about it and a telephone number to call when she's ready. When she comes back in the office, we see that there's a tear in her eye. Nori mentions the delivery from Neptune Records, which is the way that her and Sergei stayed in touch, and she tells them to send it back. In her office, Bill is waiting, and he's there to tell her that he's going to Helios. I guess they went after him after Aleda turned them down. He says it's not personal, and you believe it. He was totally dedicated to NASA. It's just a whole lot of money, and he explains it a little better to Aleda later. She doesn't say anything to him on his way out. Then after he's gone, she says goodbye, Bill, to herself, and picks up the photo of when she was just starting that he was looking at. She puts the number the agent gave her on her desk where we can see it. Aleda and Bill do have their goodbyes. He almost tears up when he says that she'll be a great flight director, and she calls him Peanut to lighten the mood. He says that her and Margo are like two peas in a pod, and given what we just saw with her situation, it does hint that Aleda is going to be very important at NASA. There's a shot where we see her working late at night, which is something that we know that she always does, and when it transitions to the next scene, it's 2 years later, and it's launch day, and you guessed it, she is the flight director for the Mars mission. And I have to give Coral Pena credit here. She does these scenes so well. It really gets you pumped up to see her in that position, and it is still a race to get there first. We see Ed and Danny launch from orbit on Phoenix. Sojourner 1 lift off from the moon. It's our first shot of what the Sojourner craft looks like. And then we see the Soviet Mars 94 mission take off as Margo looks on. Considering this is 2 years later, that their ship is taking off, it's heavily implied that she did give them the secrets that they needed, and you understand the uncomfortable look on her face. Nori comes in to tell her the president is on the line, and it is Ellen. She won her race, and now NASA is trying to win theirs, and the episode ends there.
Nothing changes. we continue with the rescue mission.
We're just gonna ignore Dev?
Give me an updated state vector for the Russian vessel. You got a problem, Danny?
Yes, Ed, Danny does have a problem. In fact, he has many of them. In the opening of the episode, you see all 3 ships in transit. Ed is in high spirits when he contacts Helios Mission Control to tell them that they've crunched the numbers and there's no way the other ships can catch them now. They believe they've won the race, they'll be the first to Mars, and it looks like his old employer, NASA, will be the last to get there. He tells his boss, Deb Ayesa, that it's time to celebrate as they're going to win this Interstellar Exploration Prize, which I guess has a pretty big amount of money attached to it. Deb declares that he won't be keeping the money for himself, that he'll split it evenly amongst all of Helios' staff, and you see that Karen and Bill are awed by his generosity. Things are looking good for the upstart private space program. In his words, they've beaten the world's superpowers at their own game. Danielle makes a call to the Phoenix to concede the race to her former commander and his crew, and he makes the comment that innovation and out-of-the-box thinking win the day every time. This all turns out to be a setup because NASA still has one more trick up its sleeve. After telling Kelly to fire up a shanty on her iPod, which didn't come out in our timeline until 2001, they unfurl a massive solar sail, which will change the race and get them there 8 days before everyone else. It's clear no one anticipated this, and when Deb asks his staff how they can retake the lead, he finds out that they can't, at least not without doing something extremely dangerous. Karen tries to reason that getting there first isn't more important than getting there in one piece. And let's just say Deb disagrees. For him, it's the only thing that matters. And to make his point, he smashes a monitor on the ground before walking out of the room. We've all been kind of expecting there to be a darker side to Deb and his motivations, and that definitely comes back up before the end of the episode. There's a nice scene where Danielle calls Ed to gloat a little, and even though he's crushed, their personal history and the surprise of NASA's innovation leaves him with no choice but to congratulate her on her win, and for her to say she learned from the best. After the opening credits, we see some of the newscasts about how the sail changed the race, and the response from Roscosmos, who maintain that the Soviets can and will still get there first, which seems pretty unlikely because neither of the other 2 teams had been mentioning them as a threat. You also get a closer look at this backlash to the transition to helium-3 and fusion energy. That also comes up in President Ellen's meeting with the Speaker of the House, who's a Democrat that she has to deal with to get her budget approved. They're trying to strike a grand bargain to balance the budget and to show the people that bipartisanship works. But this idea of NASA being massively profitable without sharing is, in his words, causing blowback from his constituents, but he's likely also referring to the fossil fuel lobby. It's not really clear what the show is trying to do with this other than show that Ellen is trying to do good in her position of power but is coming up against resistance. After the meeting, Larry senses that she's stressed, so he makes the suggestion that they go to visit JSC, which she hasn't been to since she won the election. When she arrives, there's more protesters outside, and you see that Jimmy Stevens is in the crowd. He brought up problems he had with NASA at Danny's wedding, so I guess it makes sense for him to be at this protest where he gets recognized by a reporter, and then a girl named Sunny comes up to introduce herself and invite him to have beers with her and her friends afterwards. When they get together, you see that her boyfriend is the Moon Marine pilot that Tracy was training to fly the LSAM in season 2. He doesn't believe that the government is telling the real story of what happened on the moon, which we know is true, but him and his friends have twisted things around to fit a different narrative, where rather than covering up a second reactor, this is all about dividing the moon to split up the helium-3. And there are some interesting things going on in this part of the story, but it does feel a little out of place, so I'm not sure how I feel about what's going on here. In space, there's a little montage of life on Sojourner and Phoenix to give an idea of what the trip is like. Things look a lot more comfortable on the ladder. We even see Ed jogging around thanks to the spin gravity. But we do see that morale is high under Danielle's command, even if it is just the quiet before the storm. On Phoenix, the crew are drinking brews and messing around, and the lioness who showed Tracy Jamestown for the first time when she first arrived is acting out a scene from the movie about Tracy and Gordo when Danny walks in. This leads to a confrontation where he sort of pushes him around and pressures him into doing this other scene from the movie, which is uncomfortable for everyone. And then Ed shows up to break it up. He stresses that he needs Danny to lead by example. After all, this is the reason that he wanted to bring him in the first place, to straighten him out, to give him a purpose. And he'll need him to control his temper to do that, which all feels like foreshadowing for something bad that'll happen before the trip is over. At JSC, Ellen enters mission control and gets her photo op and a standing ovation. She doesn't have to pretend to be thrilled to be back. It's clear that it makes her emotional. Margo sort of pulls Aleda aside and says it never changes. The people at NASA do all the hard work, but the politicians grab the glory. When Aleda points out that Ellen's one of them, Margo is quick to warn her that she's not anymore. Ellen gives a moving speech about how they pulled things together, how they worked as a team to beat Helios, and when she thanks them for their service to their country, you see Margo drop her head with a tinge of shame, and this, along with a lot of other hints, confirm that she did have to help the Soviets with their nuclear engine. That engine will be the catalyst for the episode-ending crisis. On Sojourner, Kelly gets a call from a cosmonaut on Mars 94. He warns her that his commanders are going to do something very dangerous to try to win the race. And before he can get into the details, he has to get off the call, and then you see them fire up those nuclear engines. They have a plan that would get them there 3 days ahead of everyone else, but when their burn doesn't last long enough, it's obvious that they have a major malfunction. Danielle tells Ed that their engines are in meltdown, and there's only 72 hours to make a rescue attempt. Neither of the ships have enough fuel to do the rescue and still make Mars orbit, so it means that going after them is also a ticket home. Ed realizes that it makes the most sense for Phoenix to do it, and is willing to sacrifice his chance at glory. Only when he explains this to Helios Mission Control, everyone who had a history with NASA is all for it, while Deb and his faithful vote to keep going and let NASA deal with the rescue. There are two flashes here you can't miss. Initially, Danny isn't behind Ed's plan, and on the ground, Karen is starting to have second thoughts about Deb's motivations. And I mentioned in my last video that in future seasons, it was getting hard to imagine who would be left at NASA. But after seeing this, that extra money might not be as much of an incentive. When Ed finds out what they decided, he decides not to change anything. He's going to go ahead with the rescue mission, but he finds out that when they sent the last message, they also sent a software update that locked them out of the controls. Dev anticipated that Ed wouldn't follow the orders, so he took over the ship, and now it's essentially flying on autopilot. The news gets around, and I love that Margo suggested nationalizing his company, but in the end, NASA decides to do what needs done. They throw away their mission to Mars and set out to save the cosmonauts' lives. On the approach, Danny tells her crew that the Soviet ship uses the same fuel as Sojourner and asks one of her crew to go and film the ship to see if Houston can figure out a way to transfer the fuel over. Of course, when they bring the cosmonauts over, things start to go wrong. Aleda and Margo notice a problem on Earth, but because of the time that it takes a message to get from them to the crew, they aren't able to warn them. Mars 94 ends up crashing into Sojourner. 2 astronauts and 1 cosmonaut are killed, and the episode ends with everything up in the air.
I love taking risks. Love negotiating. I love building things from the ground up. And I'm damn good at it.
And I think I love goo balls. I mean, it was right there ready to go for them. The episode opens with a stunning burial at sea. Commander Poole cites Dr. Martin Luther King's observation that there is democracy in death and that we all die, and concludes by saying that death is not the end, it's only the beginning. Then she lets the Soviet commander say goodbye to his fallen cosmonaut, and they send the three bodies on their final journey as the world watches. You see President Ellen Wilson address the nation, and since this is now a joint mission, the Soviets arrive at JSC. Margo welcomes the director of Roscosmos, who moves quickly to put pressure on her. Of course, they know Margo is compromised, and even though they said they wouldn't ask for more, circumstances have changed. Because she knows that she's going to have to go along with the request, she decides to make her own demand that she'll only work with Sergei. You learn that after she helped them, he dropped off the radar, and she tells her to get him there in 2 weeks or she won't cooperate. Lenara says it's not possible, but she looks like she's considering it. And this is the classic situation that once they have you, there's no way to stop them for asking for more. She really is powerless to stop this from happening. The crew on the Phoenix are able to retake control by crashing the system to get it to start in safe mode so that they could roll back to the older version that doesn't have the update that allowed Deb to take control. Ed sends a message that it's his ship again and tells Deb that he dishonored their crew. That inspires Karen to resign, and Deb doesn't want that to happen and tries to talk her out of it before he just gets upset and starts threatening her. This is a 1-2 Baldwin punch that undermines the way Deb is running the Helios mission, and Karen is right to push back when he says that it was a group's decision. It does put him in a tough spot though, and it'll be interesting to see what he does in retaliation. We do see that Sojourner is able to transfer fuel from Mars 94. There are some shots of Kelly working in space, and then she has a moment with the cosmonaut who reached out to her over the radio. It feels pretty obvious that this will all lead somewhere, and we'll see that later in the episode. Danielle gets a nice message from her son-in-law, who is supportive and says that he misses her, and that almost makes you fear for her safety in the upcoming mission. Ed is getting messages from Karen, and you can see that they're both leaning into this closeness that they have, which isn't necessarily setting them up to get back together, but it is interesting to note that they're so drawn to each other. Danny definitely notices it. We see a pretty heavy-handed shot of him that looks ominous. He's watching, and then he goes and has an awkward conversation with Nick where he fishes for information on how to get past security. That ends with him finding out a password he can use to get admin access to everyone's D-mail. And of course, he starts looking at the messages that Karen sent to Ed. He sees that they're on good terms, and that makes him start making the psycho crazy faces again. Phoenix enters a stable Mars orbit. Ed's ready to prepare for landing, but there are major dust storms on the surface that make it impossible. They arrive days ahead of Sojourner, but now they're going to have to wait until things clear up, which makes it a race again. Danny sends a message to explain this to his brother Jimmy, and he mentions that he's having issues dealing with Ed being his commander. At the same time on Earth, we see Wayne go visit Karen and cook her up a batch of Humboldt County goo balls to get her wasted. It's interesting that there are characters in both these interactions that know the truth about the affair that are not named Ed. Wayne presses Karen to find out what she might do with herself now that she's no longer at Helios, and brings up that Molly got herself into painting after she left NASA, so it's good to at least hear that Molly's out there somewhere. After the goo balls kick in, Karen sends an intoxicatedly excited message to Ed that really appears to get Danny's blood boiling when he watches it. But at the same time, it's kind of a nice touch in that it reestablishes what a monumental task a trip to Mars actually is. The achievement of that almost gets diminished when you have a three-party race. So even though this scene is more about establishing Karen not knowing what she'll do next, and is brought out through the train wreck of a character that Danny is, I'm glad they added it. Ed shows up at his door and orders him to his cabin, but it's just to play that game of spades he mentioned earlier, and he wants to have a conversation. As they're talking, Danny turns things towards talk about Karen, and it gets unsurprisingly uncomfortable. I suppose this is to continue to build up the tension, but since that's not really been the strongest part of things, I guess the more salvageable thing that comes from it is that it's evident the experience of his marriage falling apart has changed Ed's black and white thinking breathtaking to a degree, and he is aware of it, but he also believes it doesn't change how he'd react if he ever finds out who Karen slept with. And it's pretty annoying that Danny's tiptoeing around this and bringing it up, while it seems even more likely that it's going to get exposed considering that more people than him know about it. At JSC, you see that Aleda is starting to notice all the similarities with the Soviet engine. She takes her suspicions to Margo, who knows the truth and knows that it's bad for her, but can buy some time to try to deflect Aleda's attention away with everything else that's going on. This creates a complicated situation. NASA and Roscosmos have to work together to keep their people alive. Margo recognizes that Aleda is the future of what she wants the agency to look like, someone to follow in her footsteps. And it makes you wonder where things will eventually start to fall apart, because they pretty much have to. The tension there is echoed on Sojourner, where after they start their burn to Mars, they realize that there may have been some damage to one of the engines in the collision. None of Danielle's crew are trained in nuclear propulsion, so they have to consider letting one of the Soviets take the lead. On the brighter side of things, Sergei is brought to JSC, although he's looking a lot worse for the wear. It turns out that the reason that Margo couldn't get a hold of him after he was replaced was that he got thrown into a KGB prison. She's surprised to find out he got tortured because she thought things got better after Gorbachev came to power, but he says there's no controlling the KGB in a way that makes you believe him. The big news here is that she has a plan to try to get them both out from under their thumb. But he has good reason to be terrified that they'll retaliate against his family and doesn't want her to go ahead with it. Things come to a head a few days later when Sojourner makes Mars orbit. At Mission Control, Margo and Sergei have a nice chat to remind us how difficult it is to land on Mars. And they call the descent the 7 minutes of terror at NASA, which is where the episode gets its name. Just as Margo points out the thing that everyone watching noticed, that Sergei is able to smile again watching this all play out, Aleda interrupts because she's made an absolutely damning discovery. Not only can she prove that the Soviet engine is the same, it's made worse that she knows exactly what plans they got a hold of. Alexei knows too much because he was trained on an exact copy of their 92 engine. And faced with these facts, Margo can't dispute her findings. Again, she can buy a little more time because they're in the middle of trying to land their ship. But she does have to tell Aleda that she'll take the information she discovered to the DOJ. This is a wonderfully crafted pickle because we know all of what Margo did was in the interest of saving lives. That part's not even debatable. But during this season, they put her in situations that make her unlikable because she's making decisions that go against what other characters we also like want. Now, the person that can expose all of this is one whose motives are also as near to pure as they could be. Margo's never crossed the line of being unsympathetic, and now it almost seems impossible for her to get out of this situation with clean hands. It seems way more likely that she'll lose everything. And as she walks into the little room with the telephone, you see her grapple with the weight she'll be carrying as she tries to figure out what to do. The other great setup the show crafted is what's happening in orbit. There's a point in that where the commander has to make a decision on whether the dust storm has cleared up enough to land. Helios reaches that minutes ahead of Sojourner, and if they decide to pass, they have to wait 2 hours to try again. That means there's pressure on them to act aggressively because they might not get the chance to be first when they come back around. We see them thinking about the problem independently, and the two different commanders reach two different conclusions when they look at the data. Ed asks Danny if he's willing to go for it, while Danny tells her crew that they'll have to wait. Only she ends up getting pressured by the Soviet commander when they see that Helios has decided to land. There's a ton of tension between them, and there's a lot of little things in how they put this together to crank that all the way up. You watch Ed and Danny's craft just sort of silently slip away while the focus is firmly on what Danielle will do. We know this is important to her, we know this is important to everybody involved, and that she should be the one who makes the sensible and safe decision. So when things clear just enough, it really slaps you in the face when she tells them to button up because they're going straight in. I swear sometimes it feels like this show's cheating because these things like going to a planet for the first time, there's just so much hell yeah wrapped into that idea. And we see things get intense right away for Popeye, which is in the lead. Ed remembers his time on Apollo 10 with Gordo before deciding to continue, but he's losing the systems that tell him where he is and how close they are to the ground. Things are bumpier on Sojourner, which lands right on the surface rather than sending a landing craft ahead. That means the lives of their entire crew are on the line, but they aren't running into the same problems that Helios is experiencing. When Ed does get a little bit of visibility back, he sees how dangerous their situation is. And after he looks over at Danny, he makes the decision to abort. He does this knowing that he's giving up his chance to be first. And initially you think this is about saving Gordo and Tracy's son, but what's probably more important here is that it shows that he's grown as a character. I guess at this point in his life, if he were alone, he would probably risk it, but also I think the old Ed would have continued regardless of whether it put someone else at risk or not. It makes it a gut punch to see Sojourner touch down while Popeye is on its way back into orbit, because you know what's going on in Ed's head at that time, but you have to like the way he carried himself throughout the mission. Plus, it's kind of fun to see the hurt look on Danny's face as Danielle announces that she safely landed 8 humans at Happy Valley Base on the surface of Mars. If there has to be winners and losers, it can't be a bad thing when Commander Poole comes out on top. They cue up that musical piece that they play in all these big scenes, which by itself tends to make the eyes a little glassy. It's impossible to not get pumped up watching everyone cheer and hug at Mission Control. Aleda's in charge, Margo remains cool but looks satisfied, and that leaves it up to Sergei to be the one who lets out a crazy cheer. It's triumphant even though there are a lot of people who would have been there in previous seasons missing. It wraps up with Sergei and Margo having a moment where she tells him not to worry because she will figure out a way to keep his family safe before going over to congratulate Aleda. At Helios, Deb looks devastated, as does Bill, who has to be missing NASA in this moment, and we even see Deb's partner, Richard Hilliard, make his first appearance as he watches his reaction to the bad news. At home, Karen watches it play out. She's disappointed for Ed but proud of Kelly, while being relieved that they're both still alive. At the White House, President Wilson sets the stage with Mikhail Gorbachev at her side. She talks about the partnership and working together, and that sets up the somewhat comical ending where you see that the Soviet commander has a plan to get to the surface first. He essentially starts to make a break for it while Danielle's prepping the crew. So when it's time to see this historic moment on television, it ends with her grabbing him in an attempt to catch up so that they both tumble onto the surface at the same time, as you hear the announcer saying, "How inspiring," and the episode ends there.
If you're a kid out there that feels like maybe you're broken somehow, like the world would be better off without you in it, I promise you, it's the world that's broken, not you.
Any landing you can walk away from is a good one. We heard Neil Armstrong say the same thing back in season 1 when he was the first American to land on the moon. Danielle saying it on Mars is a nice touch that brings up memories of all that's been accomplished in this alternate timeline, but also made me consider how different the situation they're encountering on the Red Planet is. I think they did a good job of doing that with the music too. It reminded me of the old westerns, and when you add some atmosphere and some color, this doesn't feel anything like the moon. 30 years after NASA lost that, their unplanned joint mission with Roscosmos did get to Mars first, but the decision to make the low visibility landing cost them their ship. We watch as Ed and Danny bring the Helios lander down for second place, and the unceremonious way they plant their flag and the look on Ed's face does a great job to show you how they feel about it. There's a nice little news section that lays out all of what's happening now that the race is over. Even though it was technically a tie, the US News considers it a win for the country because it was their ship that got them there. Now there's a race to find water, and Helios has located some small deposits, which is enough for them to start manufacturing their methane fuel. This is now in everyone's interest with Sojourner grounded. Phoenix will be everyone's ride back to Earth, and they need that methane since NASA uses different fuel. Trying to cram 8 people into a hab with only enough provisions for 6 makes things difficult for the joint mission. They need to find water, create their own oxygen, set up their nuclear power generator, grow their own food, and even though this all looks inspiring from back on Earth, tensions are building between the two crews fast. It's cramped, hot, they're rationing water, and the Soviet commander seems committed to challenging Danielle every chance he gets. The one place where there's the opposite of tension is between Kelly and Alexei, but that seems like it's probably going to cause some real problems later. Things are going a little smoother at Heliospace, but Danny is still watching Ed's messages to Karen. He finds out that he was the reason that Ed decided to abort their landing, and that makes things even more uncomfortable between them. As much as I haven't been enjoying this story, I do like how charged this revelation is. It stings because they could have been first if Ed had seen him as a regular astronaut. And now Danny's hearing that this guy who he resents because of Karen thinks of him as a son. This works a little better than Danny just wanting to be with Karen, and Ed is actively making things worse because he's trying to do what he did with Gordo. You can understand why Ed is doing it, but we also know that it's a mistake. We see things start to bubble up when he hurts his hand. He gets an attitude when Ed tries to show concern, and he gets his hands on some Tylenol with codeine that we'll talk about again in a minute. In other not going to end well developments, Margo contacts General Bradford about getting Sergei's family out in exchange for his defection. She doesn't mention him by name, but assures the now chairman of the Joint Chiefs that he'll be a valuable asset to NASA. The mention of Black Ops makes this sound like a very bad idea, but I guess it does make sense given her position. I don't love that it continues to be hard to see how she gets out of this. In fact, I really don't see it happening, and I also didn't love to see Karen go back to Helios at first. We do find out that that was all set in motion by Roscosmos reaching out to her. And since it was satisfying to see her turn the tables some on Dev, I guess that might turn out alright. I just don't see how her wanting to start things from the ground up and being good at it fits in here. Also, I don't know where it's heading, but they've been quietly introducing Dev's partner Richard Hilliard. Last episode, we saw him looking at Dev in Mission Control after they aborted the landing, and here we see that there are some tensions between them because Mars is costing so much money. You get to know the people at Happy Valley Base through a series of TV interviews they're recording. Things get interesting when Will, who's been inspired by their monumental achievement, comes out as gay. I think this works pretty well in that I can see why he did it. When he explains his timing to Danielle, it absolutely makes sense from his perspective. Plus, it's nice to see someone who's awed by this experience of a brand new world. At the same time, it creates problems, so when Danielle doesn't react the way you'd hope she would, that makes sense too. Where it gets ugly is with his old pal Roland, the Soviet defector from last season, who he's been training with for the last couple of years. They've grown close, and now he doesn't want anything to do with him. He goes as far as going to Danielle and trying to get reassigned, which I don't know how he thought that might turn out considering how many people are there. It's not necessarily surprising to see someone have such a negative reaction to homosexuality. It's ridiculous, but there are a lot of backward people out there. Ellen even reminds us in this episode about Deke's negative reaction in season 1. It also wasn't out of the ordinary for people to be irrationally afraid of AIDS in the early years. Though in our timeline, it seems like by 94 that wouldn't fly. Danielle tells him that they all had HIV tests on Earth before they left, but doesn't say, and besides, you can't get AIDS just by being next to someone. I'm not sure if the show is trying to point out something about Roland, or if it's trying to say that progress on people knowing about AIDS is slower in this reality. Either way, his reaction is rough to watch, and Will's announcement puts Ellen in a very difficult spot. On the one hand, Ellen and Larry understand what a psychological toll staying in the closet can take on a person. On the other, doing that has made it possible for them to become the most powerful couple in the world. I suppose the show has made the point that this power has its limits, and we see Larry come up with a version of don't ask, don't tell to temporarily solve their problem at the cost of it not helping Will at all, knowing that he'll be discharged from the army when he returns. What she calls uniforms first is not a perfect solution in any timeline, but it does work for her politically in this one. On a personal level, it's not clear how she'll live with the decision, but that seems primed to take a back seat to the other incoming scandal that we learn about at the end. Karen helps to broker a deal with Roscosmos, who've discovered a large deposit of liquid water. The show never explains why they were able to find this and NASA wasn't, but I guess we're just supposed to accept that. It sets up a situation where Helios and the Soviets team up behind NASA's back because Ed is the one who can get them there. By helping them, Helios will also benefit from this huge discovery. Sergei comes through to tip Margo off about what's going on. It's a cute scene where at first I thought he was betraying her, installing a listening device or something like that, but it turns out that he leaves an equation on her record. When she solves it, she knows what the secret mission is about, and she goes and tells Aleida. She goes straight to tell Danielle, which seemed a little impulsive. They had shown that she was suspicious of the Soviets in mission control because of what she knows about the engine, but it was still a little surprising that she just exposed what they were doing like that. I'm not sure if this will come up again later, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Danielle tells everyone else after Ed's well-intentioned Thanksgiving party turns into a brawl, which I guess that always happens no matter where you have one of these things. Will finally calls out Roland for acting weird around him, and they do fight. Danielle finally lets the Soviet commander know what she thinks, and everyone in her crew is pissed about the water. Ed tries to smooth things over with Kelly, and she talks him into bringing her along because she thinks there's a good chance there might be life in that water. Also, when he goes back to his hab, he sends a message to Karen telling her that he's worried about Danny, which of course gets intercepted. So Danny has burnt through his Tylenol with codeine, and he's gone back and got some stronger oxycodone and a little bit of speed to go along with it. They had a conversation where Ed told him that he would change the medical protocol so he could stay on the planet. And this is another example of him bending the rules so he can try to recreate what he did with Gordo. When he's talking to Karen, he tells her that he's worried. And you can imagine how that might sit with the now loaded to the gills Danny, who, when he hears that he thinks that he might not be cut out for this, starts punching the screen. The episode ends with Ellen announcing her new policy. She confirms that it's too late to help Will in his situation. On the news, you see it goes too far for Republicans and not far enough for Democrats, which is something that they expected. Larry's assistant is at a bar talking to another gay friend, or at least someone pretending to be a friend, about this new policy and his relationship with the first gentleman. He mentions that they've had relations in the Oval Office that bring to mind the real-world Monica Lewinsky scandal. On his way out, the friend gets a call and tells the person on the other end that he has to meet him in person to tell him what he just found out. It's not entirely clear if it's his intention, but it looks like he'll end up exposing Larry's secret, and that would put Ellen in an even tougher situation.
If we do not see each other again.
We will. We will see each other again.
The joint mission to go discover liquid water between Helios and the Soviets is coming together. They leave Happy Valley Base, and Kelly secretly blows a kiss to Alexei on his way out. At Mission Control, Aleida looks relieved to finally have them leave her space, but there isn't any indication she'll be backing down from her investigation into the stolen engine plans. The worst revelation in all of this comes when Sergei goes to say goodbye to Margo. She's expecting him to move over to Helios's mission command with the others, but he explains that he's being sent back to Moscow immediately. This will make her plan to rescue him and his family impossible, and for all her efforts, this trip to the US will end up being a temporary reprieve from his incarceration rather than his path to freedom. It takes her time to work through all the options in her head and realize there's nothing she can do. And after their devastating goodbye, she breaks down crying into her couch cushion so no one will hear. It's a great visual representation of her situation, and a reminder that her choices have brought her to a place where she's truly alone. There's an underlying sense of futility when she stops him from saying what he wanted to say in case they never see each other again by saying they will. Everyone understands that won't happen, but what else do you do when someone you love is being taken away towards a horrible fate? It seems like most fans have turned against Margo and want to see her get what she has coming, but I still find her sympathetic, and the performances here really made this scene hit hard for me. In another difficult situation, First Gentleman Larry is being interviewed in a House subcommittee hearing on NASA contracts. The implication is that he's using his influence to hand out contracts to private firms that he favors, and he seems to be doing a pretty good job of defending himself right up until things turn to questions about an affair. This was set up at the end of the last episode, and we see him bring in the aide in question to ask who he's been talking to. Given the power dynamics in play, it's pretty brutal to watch this aide realize what's going to happen to his life as a result. But it works to show us the lengths Larry might go to try to fight against these totally true accusations. Understandably, Ellen tears into him when she finds out. She wants to know why he couldn't keep it in his pants for even one term, and what's so special about this aide that he would jeopardize everything they worked for. They have an intense exchange where Larry pleads his case. That all ends up being overshadowed when he mentions Pam's name when they're talking about making sacrifices. Because Ellen believed her cover story when she left, she was under the impression that Pam left her to go back to her partner. She's shocked to find out that she really left so that Ellen can move forward with her career. She also feels betrayed that Larry didn't tell her the truth, and that makes you wonder what will happen when news of his affair starts getting out. They bring in a Karl Rove type who's telling a story about Lee Atwater on his way in just to remind you how nasty this politics business is. And he suggests they need to go after the person who brought the questions up because he's already had a sex scandal and he believes that he has more skeletons in his closet. There's a moment when he says their best defense is their picture-perfect marriage. And even though Ellen and Larry know this is all an elaborate lie, they also understand that he's right. Apparently, it doesn't sit right with Ellen, though, and after she leaves, we see her clear her schedule to make a low-key trip to see Pam. She arrives at her front door and asks to come in, but we'll have to wait until next week to see what happens when they talk. I mentioned before that I wasn't really sure about this Jimmy storyline, and it picks back up in this episode where we see he's living at Danny's place with his wife, and later we'll see her tell her husband in a call that she's worried about him. Part of that is his new friends, which I don't know what to call them, maybe NASA Anon or something like that. And we see that they're trying to use his connections for something they have planned. It seems like he's set up to fall for the attention that they give him, and it doesn't seem likely that it's sincere. Sonny goes with him to JSC to try to get a hold of a badge, and the whole thing makes you feel bad for what's happening. It's clear she's trying to make him complicit, and he's running into all of these people who know his parents and are happy to see him. In the end, he grabs Rossi's badge after he shows him this great tribute to his mom and that first letter she got during training that changed her life. And it all just kind of makes you feel dirty. Rossi's the guy who gave Tracy another chance at Jamestown when she was really messing up and giving him a lot of problems. So the history there, it's all just, ugh. Later at home, all of this makes Jimmy feel some remorse, and he decides to call Sonny and try to talk her into taking the badge back. He finds out that they've already used it when they show up at his house with the statues of his parents. Initially, he seems relieved and almost thinks it's funny, but it makes you wonder if there's more to the plan that he doesn't know about. Having this in his possession could implicate him in something much worse, and I think there's a good chance they're setting him up. On Mars, the team that did the right thing and went and saved the Soviets and then got there first are looking pretty bummed out. The astronauts at Happy Valley Base are dealing with the fallout from Will's announcement and being left out of this secret mission. On the bright side, at least they have a lot more room to work with, and it looks like they may have fixed some of the problems because they're not all sitting around sweating. Kelly has a call with Alexei, who tips her off that they're getting ready to start drilling. She gets upset because she hasn't finished her tests on the core sample, and she talks to Ed to try to get him to wait until she's done with her work. He just shrugs it off, saying they've done everything they're required to do, and stresses the fact that NASA is the one who came up with these rules. Over at Helios Base, Danny is continuing to pop pills, and it's starting to become clear that there's something wrong with him. Ed has to call his name several times in front of the group during a meeting while he is just sort of staring at lights blinking on the wall. When he walks into him spacing out after a call with his wife, he gives a look to show that he knows there's something going on, but he doesn't do anything about it. A little later, just to really drive the point home, Danny flips out and stomps a robotic toy dog to death in front of everyone. And while this was a little bit goofy, it's a great choice to show how unhinged he is. Of course, this thing is annoying him, but come on, it looks like an adorable puppy. This earns him a talking to from Ed, where he takes him off the flight to the drilling site. He also calls him out for taking drugs, but still doesn't go any further. He just assigns him to help out Nick on communications, and then Danny acts up and looks like he wants to hit him, and instead of confining him to quarters or sending him back to Polaris, Ed just punks him out and leaves it at that. Back on Earth, Aleida meets with her husband, and we learn that they're separated. The implication is that over the last couple of years that we skipped ahead, those problems we heard them discussing about her always being at work and everything else with her father finally caught up to them. As part of her investigation, she asked him to help her look at the list of people who had access to the plans that the Soviets got their hands on. After we get the impression that Aleida is hoping that they might be able to get back together and that her father's situation is getting worse, her husband brings up that it might not be someone that works for her, implying that it could be someone above her that is compromised. Later, she goes into Margo's office and it seems like she's going to accuse her, but instead she thinks it's her assistant Emma. Margo laughs this off because it's actually pretty funny, but the reality is that Aleida went there because she hasn't been able to believe that Margo could be the one who's working with the Soviets. And as someone who hasn't completely turned my back on Margo, this is truly horrifying. Watching her gaslight Aleida and get to the point of threatening her, I mean, I know her career is on the line and it's the logical path for her to take, but there's no excusing it. If the shoe were on the other foot, she'd be doing the exact same thing Aleida is. And so when we see her go out into the lobby and finally have the realization as she's looking at Margo's picture, there's a satisfaction, but it's all just tragic. The drilling operation is on the way, and out on the ridge, the Soviet commander asked the question, I wonder what this valley will look like in 10, 20, or 100 years. And he probably should have thought more in the scale of 20 minutes, but we'll get to that. They start drilling, and to get ready for his part back at the hab, Danny decides to prep with a handful of pills. They're monitoring the pressure to make sure that the drilling site doesn't explode, and Nick steps away to run some numbers, leaving Danny in charge. I'm not sure if it's implied that he's so wasted that he can't respond, or that he's doing it on purpose to sabotage Ed. He's definitely wasted, but he also has some flashes of the confrontation with Ed, but it doesn't really matter because he doesn't do his job and things turn catastrophic. It's chaotic and I'm not sure what the damage will be when the dust settles, but Ed and Isabel are injured from the drill in the beginning. They bring them back in the MSAM and then all hell breaks loose when the ridge starts to come down. Danny is able to get Ed to safety and it looked like the Soviet commander who went ahead to prepare the med bay made it into the other hab. Beyond that, Alexei, Louisa, Nick, and Isabel seem to get caught in the dust, if not the rock slide that's rolling over the base. At the very least, the MSAM will probably be lost, and it's possible that Kelly's boyfriend and the only person who knew what Danny did to cause the accident will be somewhere on the scale of injured to dead, and the episode ends there.
But if we miscalculate by even 1 meter?
These are engineering problems, my friends. And we are engineers. Shall we begin?
At Happy Valley Base, they experience the effects of the landslide. They figure out pretty quickly that it's not a Mars quake, and when they can't make contact with Helios Base, Danielle tells Will and Roland that they're going to have to go out in the rover to investigate. She tells them that whatever personal issues they have going on, they need to squash them. And nothing like a crisis to bring people back together. It looks like that's mostly been smoothed over. We watch as Alexei emerges from the dust. It turns out that the landslide buried him, but he survived. He's not able to reach anyone on the radio, and he looks like he may have sustained some injury as we watch him vomit inside his suit. Nearby, he discovers Nick's body. His face shield was shattered, so he didn't last long. And the first thing I thought about here was Danny's culpability for what happened in the accident. Nick was the only one that was there, and knew that Danny decided not to act to vent the pressure. Back on Earth, we get a scene with Ellen and Pam having their talk. She shows her the letter and they talk about how things ended. Pam admits that she lied and gave her up because she thought that one day she could make a real difference for people like them. And she's been disappointed since she's been sworn in. All she's seen her do is make compromise after compromise. Ellen delivers a reasonable response, saying sometimes you have to settle for what's possible. And they do both make their points before they get interrupted because Ellen has to leave because of the situation on Mars. There's a lot of history and you can feel the emotion between these two, who are in an almost absurd situation given the fact that Ellen is the president of the United States. The big takeaway, though, is that it feels like there's seeds planted here for Ellen to do something with her power that might redeem her in the love of her life's eyes. Or maybe not. She could decide to hold on to that power, and this would make that feel all the more tragic. At Helios, they decide to send all the engineers over to NASA to coordinate a rescue attempt. Karen stays behind because she says someone needs to visit the families. This feels like a callback to her role in season 1, all those NASA wives getting together, and it's in contrast for the person that Karen has become. But her ex-husband and her daughter are in the middle of this crisis, and if anybody understands what those families are going through, it's her. Dev looks shook, and he vows to do everything in his power to rescue Ed, and he says it in the way that seems sincere. Alexei finds Louisa, and she explains that Isabel didn't make it. Danny talks to Phoenix in orbit and finds out that they made contact with HAB 2, which has a busted antenna that's making communications difficult, and they can't raise Ed and Danny, who are trapped in HAB 1. There we find Danny patching up Ed's injury. They're in the airlock of HAB 1, and they're buried. There's an emergency beacon transmitting, and if they're not too deep, then there is a chance they could be dug out. At NASA, they assess the variety of problems they're facing. The MSAM is inoperable, so everyone on the surface is stuck there, and they know there wouldn't be much air or much time for the people trapped in HAB 1. We see Danny start to lose hope as they realize they have maybe 6 hours of breathable air. Danielle and her team arrive at HAB 2, and eventually Alexei and Louisa make it back. They're able to work out where they were, and Alexei and Kelly go out with ground-penetrating radar to search for HAB 1. They have a talk while they search where she brings up her fears about losing her father. He tries to make her feel better by telling her about his father, and you can see that this has turned into a real relationship. We also learn that he has a bad headache that he can't shake after the landslide, and they do eventually pick up the beacon signal. Jimmy and Amber Stevens are watching the news coverage on TV. Jimmy has a moment where he's really disturbed by the fact that they are advertising erectile dysfunction pills in the commercial break, and then Karen arrives to sit with them and help her keep busy by cooking dinner. As they're eating, she breaks down crying. And this does a lot to establish the character some because we haven't really got to know her yet. Eventually, they will get a call telling them that they located the HAB, and that brings some temporary relief. Although Jimmy is still acting weird because he thinks this is all some kind of cover-up for something more nefarious. At NASA, they realize HAB 1 is buried 20 meters deep. They know that they don't have that long to dig, though, because they're going to run out of air. And it's kind of funny when you think about it that they had all of these different sides spread out, all competing for everything, and they still found a way to bring it back to NASA Mission Command, which gives it that same feeling that we've had over the last couple of seasons. Margo notices Deb isn't in the conference room and decides to go look for him, and Aleida asks Bill if the Soviets ever say anything about Margo. He doesn't really know why she's asking, but it's just to remind us of that storyline that they didn't really touch on in this episode. When she finds Deb, they have a conversation, telling the same story he told Karen back in episode 2. She brings up her relationship with her dad, which we remember learning about in season 1, and then things turn a little bit when he tells her that his father worked at Kirkland and lost his job after Apollo 23 exploded on the pad. He spent the rest of his life looking for work but never found anything meaningful, and he never really recovered. He passed away before Deb graduated college, and this is the part of the story he usually leaves out because he says people like to hear about success in America. They don't like to hear about failure. They share a moment where there's mutual respect. She tells him that she thinks that his father would be proud of him, just as her estranged father was for her in his own way. She goes back in and asks if he'll join them, and he says in a minute and stays there to think. When he returns, he brings up a dangerous plan that could work. And you see everyone sort of discredit it first, and then realize they don't really have many other options. They'll have to enter a lava tube and blow a hole below the hab so that debris can flow down like grain from a hopper. After it drains, they'll be able to access it from above, and it's a pretty good solution as long as they don't blow up the hab in the process. Everyone has concerns, and Dev brings up the perfect line, probably one of the best lines in the episode, to calm them down, saying, "These are engineering problems, my friends, and we are engineers." And this is a turn for the character, or at least the way we look at him, and it kind of emphasizes what this story is all about. Humanity has its problems, individuals have their problems, but in moments of crisis, they can put that stuff aside and they can work together and they can do amazing things. Ellen returns to the White House. Larry kind of gets upset that she didn't tell him where she was going, and he freaks out some whenever she says she went to see Pam. It's pretty easy for her to turn that around because, well, all the stuff he's been doing. They argue, and when the vice president shows up, she asks him to give them the room, so she's kind of shutting him out here. Danny and Ed have no idea that the rescue's underway, and they're arguing as well. And this time he brings up Shane with a pretty surgical, "You're not teaching me to ride a bike." Of course, I don't think he knows how much this will get to Ed, but it turns out to be the right thing to really get him worked up. He provokes him to the point of hitting him, and he opens his wound, and they're able to use a anti-clotting agent to stop the bleeding. It all looks pretty painful, and I think you can see Danny showing some remorse as he's stopping the bleeding. What's interesting about this time with Ed and Danny is that initially, Danny's the one that gives up. He can't see a reason to go on. And later, they're going to flip this upside down. And they're both being affected by the weight of the situation. There's a really good chance they're going to die, and they think that they're at the end of their lives. Ed has his regrets. Danny's been living with his shame. So I really appreciated how they sort of played these two characters off each other. And it kind of fits with this overall idea of making these characters a little more human. And where that really pays off is when Karen tries to talk to Jimmy, and he brings up that he knows about the affair between her and Danny. She's taken off guard, but then she eventually comes clean and even listens when he tells her that she used him. I suppose this is part of what's been missing from this story, the complicated reasons for how it affected him. Jimmy says Danny always tried to please everyone, and we see this from the other side when he's talking to Ed and they think they're about to die. I don't know if it's enough to bring us around on Danny, especially after what he did in the last episode, and we're still in the aftermath of that. People are dying. But seeing what he's done through Jimmy's perspective, who went a completely different way in his trauma, adds another dimension. Alexei collapses and vomits when they get back to the hab. The doctor suspects that he's suffering from a subdural hematoma. They'll have to drill a hole in his skull to relieve the pressure, and they're going to need a blood transfusion, and it turns out that Kelly is a match. And that'll be important later because they're going to be looking at her blood. Will and Roland work together. They get their job done. They place the explosives. We see them triple check everything and then get ready to run before they detonate the charge. Back in Hab 1, the oxygen levels are low. Danny says he'll help Ed to get into the suits, and this time, Ed's the one that says it doesn't matter. He's the one who's giving up. He expresses regret for fighting with Kelly the last time they talked. She was angry, and we saw that he dismissed her. And this reminds him of the last time he talked to Shane when he yelled at him and told him to be a man. This is something we wanted to see Ed get to, I think, because he's been doing the same thing with Danny and it's been causing problems. And Danny apologizes for what he said, taking responsibility for all the trouble he got into with Shane. I don't think that was ever clear before, and he was happy to let everyone think that it was Shane. He says that he dragged him into all of it and let him take the heat. What kills him is that he forgave him every time. Part of that was that he was afraid of Ed, he was unhappy at home, so he really cared about this friendship, and now he feels responsible for what happened. Basically, if Shane had never met him, then he wouldn't have died. And the really sad part is, from that moment, back when they were 12 or however old they were, back when we saw him over at the house in that moment he had with Karen, he thought that if he lived the life Shane could have had, maybe it would make up for it. And now he feels like he failed, that he's ruined his life. He's going to leave his daughter behind, just like his mom and dad left him and his brother. And we see that Ed is overcome with emotion and just tries to comfort him, saying it's okay, it's okay. He's about to confess that he's the one who slept with Karen as they are about to pass out and eventually die when we hear the explosion and then they're saved. Amber and Karen get the call that they made it. Jimmy finds out. This is a really great scene. This show is so good at putting together those emotional moments. Everyone working together, everyone solving the problem, somebody celebrating that, and you're right there with them, and they hit it again one more time. A little while later, Ed wakes up. Apparently, he'll be okay. Alexei did not make it, though. Ed learns about the others. Kelly is shattered over losing Alexei, and he comforts her. And they made it through this crisis, but there are still a lot of problems. Primarily, how do they get back to Phoenix, and then how do they get back to Earth? And we're going to have to wait to the next episode to find out. Everyone from Helios and Roscosmos leaves NASA. Dev and Margo share a look, and there's a shot of her looking at the empty room and smiling. This is that shot that comes after the celebration. Just a short look helps you remember all of the triumphs they had, why Margo is such a crucial character to everything that happened at NASA. And considering her situation, the fact that she's compromised, this felt like a bad omen to me. Sort of that one last shot they show of a character before they kill him off. I mean, I don't think they're going to kill Margo off here. I think she's going to end up in prison or something along those lines. But especially the second time I watched this, it felt like it was setting something up. Back on Mars, the two remaining Soviets talk. The commander asks, what do we do about the Baldwin girl? Because they figured out that she's pregnant. This probably happened during the blood transfusion, and they don't think that she knows yet. And they don't say a lot here, but it does feel like it's supposed to be ominous. They say they have to tell Moscow first, and say that she could be a threat to the entire crew. I'm not sure I understand why they think that, but it gives us something to think about in between episodes, because this one ends right there.
You are not crazy.
We need to talk to her. Find out why she...
You have to go to the FBI, Aleda.
What? No.
We start off with a 5-month time jump to a point where everything has more or less settled down on Mars. This threw me off since it seemed like there was a cliffhanger with the conversations that the Soviets were having at the end of the last episode, but they appear to just be cool with Kelly's pregnancy now. She is very pregnant in non-optimal conditions, and by the end of the episode, they really need to get her to the Phoenix because she has preeclampsia. They were able to salvage the MSAM, but there's a problem with making enough fuel in time and getting everyone on board. They also realize that the rendezvous radar is broken, so they won't be able to dock with Phoenix. Luckily, they find out that there's a North Korean probe nearby that has one, and we'll come back around to that in a minute. At the White House, after Ellen refuses to sign a bill that would give Congress direct authority over NASA's budget and essentially end space exploration, the Speaker of the House brings up that he knows about her recording device and will subpoena the tapes looking for evidence of Larry's affair. We see them listen to the tapes and they're much worse than they remembered. If they were to hear them, he'd go to jail for perjury and she'd be impeached. They think about all the options and they realize there's nothing they can do, so Larry offers to call a press conference to confess. He tells her that she can pretend that she didn't know, make it like he betrayed her too, and that would solve their problem. This is all his fault, really. And there's some great setup here because it's nice to see that he would take responsibility, and even though there's no way around it, that she still doesn't want him to have to do it because she realizes what kind of sacrifice this is for him to make. Of course, at the moment that he gets up to the podium and gets ready to make the announcement, she steps in to take his place. She tells the American people and the world that she lied to them, and she comes out and admits she's gay. She delivers a moving speech that it's not even necessary to summarize because at this point in the story, we understand where this character is, the sacrifices that she's made, what she's risking by doing this now, and why she's telling the world that she's gay and that she's been that way since the day she was born. Since we've been following this character for 2.5 decades, the scene really delivers. Jodie Balfour really sells it in her performance, and I really like the moment at the end when she shares the look with Larry, because he's kind of been an annoying character for most of this season because of this problem that he caused, and it's just another reminder of everything they've been through together. It was nice to see Margo watching and the Speaker of the House's reaction, and then of course seeing Pam. If that wasn't enough to hit you in the heart, we watch as everyone at Happy Valley learns about her executive order to allow gay men and women to openly serve in the military, and that she'll bestow the Presidential Medal of Freedom on Will. The actor does an amazing job of delivering his reaction to the news, and when Roland tells him that he's a brave man and that he's proud of him, it's exactly what you watch a TV show like this for. Aleda has Bill over to her garage to see her crazy person bored, and then asks him to tell her she's not crazy. After he sees all the evidence, even though he doesn't want to believe it, he knows just like she does that Margo is the one who gave up the engine design. He tries to get her to go to the FBI, but of course, because of what happened with her father, she doesn't want to have anything to do with them. So when he blindsides her by bringing an agent who he filled in on everything that's going on to the outpost, she refuses to work with them and tells him that he's dead to her. They're going to go ahead and open an investigation anyway, and it really puts her in a bad spot. She has a breakdown in her garage, tearing down all the evidence from the wall, and as she's crying there, her father comes in to comfort her. She kind of tries to put on a strong face, telling him it's nothing and she'll figure it out, and then because of his dementia, he mistakes her for his dead wife. He comes back around and gives her a hug, and it really points out just how everything is kind of going wrong for her. And these last two sequences are promising for what's going to come next, because we see some great performances here from Will and from Aleda, and we can imagine that these will be the characters that we'll be following in the next season. Dev gets his ambitious plans for Mars colonization shot down. He even tried to pull out one of his inspirational speeches about the Jamestown colony, and it had zero effect on the board, who are pretty much tired of his ideas. We learn that they're going to push him out, and when Karen asks who they're going to replace him with, Richard Hilliard says that they want her as the new CEO. It's hard to say how that will play out. I don't know how much loyalty she has to him. I mean, I think they've made it clear that this is something that she would want to do. And she did have the idea that was going to save the company, because in reality, they are beholden to the shareholders. And Mars has been a disaster for everyone except for North Korea. And when Danielle and Kuznetsov get to the probe, they find a living astronaut, cosmonaut, I'm not really sure what they call them, but he's alive and he has a gun in his hand. This is the character who was on the surface in the season 2 stinger at the end there. This was his boot that we saw. And this has been an idea that people had, but I thought it was more of a joke. And as I said at the beginning, I'm just not really sure what to think about this. I'm sure they figured out how this could be possible, but it still seems a little bit like a thing that you just throw in there for a crazy twist more than anything else at this point. I'm guessing that North Korea sent this ship with the outside hope that they would get there first, and then I guess he could try to hitch a ride back home. Since there has been no talk of this on Earth, it seems like he can't get in contact with them, so they just think that he died, which there was probably a really high percentage chance that that would happen no matter what. And I guess we're going to have to wait till next week to see where it goes from here.
Yeah. Home? home. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So let me know. Wait.
Back in episode 6, Mars mission commander Danielle Poole is talking about her experience for people back on Earth. She says, "I think it's a primal urge in all of us. The need, the drive to explore. It doesn't matter how old you get. Human beings are always gonna want to see what's over that next hill." And that is a big part of what this show's about. There's a moment in the For All Mankind Season 3 finale where President of the United States Ellen Wilson invokes JFK when she tells her vice president, "We didn't do these things because they are easy, but because they are hard." She's defending NASA and space exploration in general, while he's defending the Republican Party from things like gay astronauts and a Russian-American love child. The VP is there because her closeted gay husband convinced her that having him on the ticket would help her gain vital political influence. And he wants her to resign because when faced with a scandal over an affair by that same husband, she came out publicly as gay. It's all rather complicated and difficult, and it's just one of the many things that happened to jeopardize future space exploration in Season 3. One thing that For All Mankind has always shown us is that for as difficult as it is to go to space, it's worth it. It's given us a cast of complicated characters willing to put themselves on the line to make that happen, and a timeline that's changed enough to make it believable that these projects could still exist. By the end of this season, we have 3 space programs working together in the middle of a disaster on Mars. And it feels like it all might be coming to an end. The sacrifices, the problem solving, the setbacks, the highs of people being their best for something bigger than their own survival, all the things that make a show like this so engrossing, it's all hard. And if there isn't the right people and the will to keep it going, then it all could be cast into the dustbin of history. By the time we get to episode 10, that will is starting to deteriorate. And just like it is in Ellen's presidency, the future is uncertain. The other thing the show tries to show us is that when you put aside the personal beliefs, the politics, the prejudices, and the natural competition of things, people do generally come together to triumph in the face of adversity. The early part of Season 3 was about the 3-way race to Mars between state agencies NASA and Roscosmos and the upstart private firm Helios. The accelerated timetable and the effort to get there first leads to several problems once they get there, and in the end, none of them even have the distinction of getting there first. Instead, the lone survivor of a secretly manned North Korea mission, Lee Jung-gil, became the first man to step foot on the Red Planet. The finale opens with a montage of his arrival and his lonely existence trying to make contact with home. I wasn't sure about the feasibility of him being there or what it would lead to, but regardless, watching these few minutes helped to remind us of how difficult this all is. And for what it's worth, I think they made a case that it is in fact possible, even if it was unlikely that he'd be able to survive. He's unable to make contact with Earth, and he eventually makes peace with the fact that this is a one-way trip, and he's about to take his own life when Rover 1 shows up. His hardware turns out to be more essential than he is, but this does have the potential to complicate things if Mars does become colonized. The fact that he's there doesn't become a priority because the astronauts on Mars already have one. Kelly's condition has gotten worse, and the doctor says they have a 24-hour window to get her to the Phoenix to deliver the baby, or they could both die. Everyone at the base and everyone on Earth is working on the problem because they have too much weight and not enough fuel. The solution for the weight problem is that everyone besides Kelly will stay behind. She objects to this, but one by one all the crew members volunteer in the first of many uplifting moments peppered throughout the finale. It'll be rough, but if they implement strict rations and their crops continue to produce, they should be able to survive the 1.5 years that it'll take for Sojourner 2 to get there and bring them home. The fuel problem is more complicated because they still only have enough to get 95% of the way to the Phoenix. The problem is going to require some out-of-the-box thinking to solve, and as they're working it, Margo notices Aleida is distracted. She pulls her aside for what will be their last one-on-one conversation. She explains that she already knows about the FBI investigation, And when asked, she promises that she'll explain why she helped the Soviets later, because right now they need to focus on the problem at hand because there's lives to save. What Aleida doesn't know is that her mentor found out about this when the head of Roscosmos, Miss Katish, came to offer her a way out. Because of the way things work out in the end, it's not entirely clear if Margo intended to explain what happened or not, but the promise of that is enough to get Aleida's focus where she needs it to be. When they return, she comes up with the idea to make Kelly the second stage and to have her propel herself the rest of the way to Phoenix. They'll strap what's called a PMU to her, which is essentially a jetpack, with all the extra fuel tanks and everything else that they have on hand to give her the extra push she needs to make orbit. There's a great moment after she introduces the idea where she gets asked the question, "I'm sorry, are you suggesting we light Kelly Baldwin up like a rocket?" And she just gives the deadpan answer, basically. Ed lays out the plan to Kelly, and in doing so, does a great job to explain things to us as we're watching. The other part of it is that she'll have to be on top of the ship, so he'll have to pilot it, and that means he'll have to try to land with almost no fuel. The way this conversation plays out, it makes you fear that Ed may be signing up for his last mission. Of course, he would never let anyone else do this. He wants to give his daughter and unborn grandchild the best chance they could have, and you do get the sense that he'd be okay with making the ultimate sacrifice if it came to that. He puts the best face he can on it and assures her that he's got the best pilot he knows to help them out. He's talking about Molly Cobb, who hasn't played a large role in this season. I assume this is due to the actor having scheduling conflicts. And while I would have liked to see more of her, the absence really added to the impact of her walking into mission control. She gets a standing ovation, which she quickly quiets down before asking to speak to the Queen of Darkness. It's a great full circle moment when Margo greets her. There is history here. Molly tried to pull a power move when Margo was out of town. She came back and fired her, but after the tension's been established, they quickly get to work. It's nice to see things fall back into place, for everyone to be where they're needed and doing what they do, and they even address their initial argument when Molly says Ed wanted someone there who'd had their ass on the line. Because this was such a big dispute, throughout the season there was this question of who was the better choice for commander, and to this point Danielle had shined in that role. But in the end, when it's all hands on deck, Ed's skills also proved to be indispensable. And he even got to show off the language skills he picked up during the war, when he's the only one who can talk to the North Korean. And the acting and everything I just mentioned was absolutely top shelf. Molly's entrance and her attitude, Margo's reaction, and the little smile that Ed had on his face before he revealed that he could speak Korean. While the press is assembling to report on this mission, Jimmy and his NASA Anon friends park a van outside JSC. They give him a task that he doesn't go through with, and when he returns, he realizes they're not there to steal another statue. He gets spooked after he sees some weapons in the van. He tries to call Amber, who doesn't pick up, and they knock him out and tie him up. Karen manages to get looped into this storyline when Amber calls her after she listens to Jimmy's message. In the type of sequence we've come to expect in the For All Mankind season finale, we watch as all the different stories reach their conclusion simultaneously. Danny tries to volunteer to pilot the MSAM over his guilt for the mining disaster. When Ed brushes him off, he admits that it wasn't just that he was high or it was an accident, but that he chose not to act because he was angry and a mess. Ed rightly tells him he won't put his daughter's life on the line so that he can try to absolve himself. He sends him away to do his job and promises him there'll be a reckoning when it's over. At JSC, Margo goes up front and addresses everyone working in Mission Command. Only she knows it will be the last time she'll ever do this, and there's an added layer that Aleida is the only other person that knows about the FBI investigation. She brings up being there for Apollo 11 and Gene Kranz's words, "The future is ours to fight for and win." She says he was right then and he still is today, and then breaks a little when she tells the crew what an honor and privilege it's been to work with all of them. They cheer, thinking she's just talking about this mission, but we see that Aleida realizes this is the last time she'll see Margo do this. When she hands the room over to her, we know this is a real passing of the torch. When she walks out, there's so much history that pours in. It's a bittersweet end for someone who really did give her whole life to the space program. We had seen that the intelligence services managed to get Sergei and his family out of the USSR in a video call, and know that for all her efforts, she won't be able to outrun the consequences of her mistakes. She goes back to her office and plays the piano, and we cut to Happy Valley getting ready to strap Kelly to the top of the M-SAM. We see that she's wearing a modified version of Alexei's suit. There's a last-minute exchange of I love yous between her and Ed, and then there's just an absolutely perfect bit of television. It looks amazing, the music puts you right there with her, and even though I never feared that they might kill Kelly and her unborn child, the satisfaction of her knowing she's going to make it when you see her smile as she approaches the Phoenix is short-lived, because Ed still has to manage a ballistic descent. I must have watched this 10 times now, and from the moment she separates to the smile stretching across her face, to Ed's relief knowing that no matter what happens next, he got his daughter to safety, it gets me every single time. There's no time even to process that though, because Karen is outside of JSC, and when she tries to call Jimmy's phone, she notices that his friends have it. She'll find him tied up in the back of the van and see that it's filled with explosives. When the terrorist sees her, he detonates the bomb remotely, and it destroys the building and kills her. Jimmy survives to find her in her last moments. Inside Mission Command, we see Molly helping survivors get out. Later, we'll learn that she will also lose her life while she's doing that. Aleda goes looking for Margo and finds that half of her office was sheared off in the blast. As the camera pulls out to show the devastation, we presume that she thinks that Margo was killed. On Mars, Ed survived his crash landing and is able to walk away from it. Unfortunately, when he returns to Happy Valley, Danielle has to tell him that Karen died. We get closing shots of Aleda and her family at Ground Zero, Kelly on the Phoenix with her newborn. Danny is exiled to the North Korean ship to live away from the others while they wait for Sojourner 2. Ellen goes to see Pam. We get a shot of Sergei to see that he's settling into his new life in America. And then we jump to 2003, where we see Margo in a Moscow apartment by herself. Everything is in its right place by Radiohead plays as she looks out the window and the season comes to an end. Season 3 was about going further than humans have ever gone before in our timeline. The race made it possible to get there, but also set things up for disaster. As humans, we're in a situation where wherever we go, we bring our problems with us. And that is fertile ground for drama. And I think what stands out about this finale is that while everything I said at the beginning holds true, that drive to explore, the difficulty of that, the complications and events that could conspire to bring it all down in an instant, in the end, people can come together and try not just to overcome the adversity, but build something brand new together. In the end, there's a short voiceover with Aleda recounting the voyage of the Mayflower. As it focuses in on Happy Valley Base, that thing that's been born out of the disaster of the race to Mars, she says, what was once a group of strangers, voyagers seeking a better life, had become something different, something more. And in the unlikeliest of places, they found a new home. That's the bit of hope that this show, which is essentially a sequence of near disasters, just can't shake. Going into this final episode, it was hard to imagine how we might get further missions to Mars. And now the rest of the crew who made it out have a year to survive and to start the first colony on the Red Planet. That's the kind of thing that this show does that I keep coming back for. This had some amazing moments like you'd expect, but I like this finale slightly less than Season 2's for a couple of reasons. The show has a way of introducing things that can feel insignificant at the moment, but then circle back around and deliver a big payoff. I mean, most of Aleda's story in the first season felt like an interesting but unconnected side story, and now it all makes a lot of sense. Season 3 still had a lot of that going on. I think Ed's story is the best example. I saw grown men crying in the comments because their favorite space program avatar wasn't the first person to land on Mars, but I think that only added to the ending, which was about him redeeming himself as a father. Sure, not being first on the moon is something that's haunted him, but as we learned when he was buried in the Hab, so was the way he left things with Shane before he died. For him to be there and be essential in Kelly making it to safety on the Phoenix, and to know that he was okay with sacrificing himself if it came to that, makes him come out of this season as even more of a boss, and he got to do what he does best and live to tell the story. Margo and Aleda also had a fantastic season, even though it was hard to watch at times. There are obvious parallels to her mentor Von Braun, but we understand her character much better and can see how she ended up where she did, while knowing that her intentions were mostly pure. She put everything she had into making space exploration what it is in this timeline. And that little bit of her human nature she indulged in, falling in love, led to places she couldn't come back from. Aleda will be a great replacement though, and it was fitting to have her final act in the US be getting Sergei and his family to safety. Karen and Molly's deaths hit unbelievably hard, although Molly's was almost a blink and you'd miss it situation. The way the camera lingered on the man she saved watching her walk back into the smoke stood out, but if I hadn't paused to look at the paper, I might not have put things together in my first watch. When I finished, I honestly wondered how many people might miss that. Karen's death felt like a complete shock, which I guess was the point, and I suppose if you think about it, her arc was complete. When you have a show that moves so quickly through time, it makes sense to deliver these dramatic endings rather than have these great characters just sort of fade away. But one minute she was about to step into the CEO role at Helios, and the next she's just gone. Both of the actors here gave great performances. They brought these characters to life in a way that they're both really memorable, and they're going to be missed. And geez, my thoughts are really just with Wayne after the way this played out. I loved how they came together and how Molly gave her the "I'm a selfish prick" speech. That added to her hero's ending and aligned her with the show's thesis. Yeah, she has been a prick at times, and that's been fantastic to watch, but she's also been selfless when she needed to be, and that's what she's doing in her final moments. I've been critical of both Jimmy and Danny's stories this season, so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but in case you haven't been following along, in my opinion, these were the weakest elements of this season. They did manage to make Danny's situation more sympathetic, but only after they exhausted me with the whole thing. His bad behavior did add a lot of tension along the way, but I mostly just wanted him to go away for it rather than wanting to see him come back around and redeem himself. The banishing seems like a fitting ending for how things played out, but it's a temporary one that feels a little dangling since we know that it'll be in the past by the time the next season starts. And I do want to mention that even though I didn't like a lot of what they gave him to do, KCW Johnson did a great job in the Hab and in that last moment where he comes to Ed to salvage something with his performance. It's a little bit worse with Jimmy because I'm not even sure how we're supposed to feel about that. He didn't know what his friends were up to, and you can see how he was sucked in, but what happens next? Is he the lone survivor? Do they try to pin it on him? Or does the fact that he has hero parents and that he was a victim in all this mean that nothing happens to him, that he just turns things around and that's what we're going to be seeing next time? I honestly don't know, and this is a part of the bigger problem I had with this ending. I like the hope, and I like that space exploration will continue because of this series of unexpected events. To bring things full circle, there's the parallel of Ellen saying maybe the Republican Party needs some destroying, and the fact that JSC is literally destroyed in an attack that has a lot of similarities to the Oklahoma City bombing in our timeline. Sometimes it's in the reaction after a crisis or catastrophe where change can happen, but there are a lot of things left up in the air, so it doesn't feel as neat. It doesn't have that feeling of everything falling into place that you got at the end of season 2. And to be fair, that's a pretty high bar, so by no means am I saying that this wasn't enjoyable or that it was bad. The highs were absolutely high, and that's enough to keep me coming back. When it's doing what it does best, there really isn't anything else like it on TV. I guess we'll have to wait and see how they handle the transition to know if it'll make sense. I had been worried about the lack of likable new characters, and I do think that Kelly and Will certainly are a good starting point for season 4. Deb ended up having a pretty satisfying arc by the end of the season, and with Karen out of the way, I'm sure we're going to see more of him. Everyone else is getting old, a little too old, and that makes it feel a little slim. But hey, with Margo in Moscow, we'll finally get to see things from the Soviet perspective, which is something that's been lacking in this show. And we'll get a ton of new characters there. It is something to look forward to, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Let me know in the comments what you thought about Season 3 overall, what you thought about the finale, and what you're hoping to see in Season 4. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.